Hello, everybody. I'm delighted you're able to join us this morning. I'm just going to hang on for a minute or two to allow everyone to log in and connect. We have over 350 people registered, I believe. So the issue of visas and work permits is certainly an area where there's a lot of interest. We've 3 speakers this morning, and I'll introduce those people to you shortly. We're just going to hang on there for another couple of seconds just to make sure everyone's online. It's actually funny, pre-COVID, we'd run these breakfast briefings. You might have heard me say this before, but we'd run these breakfast briefings as physical events. And depending on location, largely Dublin, we'd be restricted to about 80, maybe 100 participants. With the numbers we have today, there's really a strong argument to keep these online or possibly live stream them in person when we can all meet face to face again. So some kites flying, you would have seen in the news last night about that. So hopefully some easing of restrictions on the way. Okay, I think everybody is online by now, so we'll officially kick off. So, hello and a very warm welcome to everyone who has just logged on for this NRF breakfast briefing, proudly sponsored by Contracting Plus. My name is Jimmy Sheehan. I'm Managing Director of Contracting Plus, Ireland's leading provider of umbrella companies and accountants of choice for thousands of professional contractors and independent consultants. I hope you've got your coffee in one hand and a pen and notepad at the ready, because there's some really good learnings in the presentations this morning. Before we get started, though, I'm just going to ask you to type into the comments box any number between 1 and 350. I just need 5 numbers between 1 and 350. I'll take any 5, the first 5, so the first 5 numbers that come up, and more on why I'm asking for these later on. Out of curiosity, last night, I was just taking a look at the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment website to look at what skills were on the current list of critical skills. And I have to say, I was surprised to see how comprehensive the list was. Science professionals, there was engineering professionals, ICT, health, regulatory professionals. So, it's little wonder we've so many people tuned in this morning. It seems that the pool of talent at the high skills end is particularly shallow in Ireland at the moment. There is a question box on your screen. As questions come up, pop them in there, and we start to get through as many of those as possible during the Q&A session after both presentations. So, our first presentation this morning is by Stefana Shishkova. Stefana is Operations Manager with Visa First. Visa First is a leading provider of visa processing and immigration services for both corporates and individuals. They process over 10,000 visas all over the world every year, and their service removes the hassle and the uncertainty and the time associated with arranging travel visas and permits. Stefana herself loves to travel, explore new countries and cultures, and once we're allowed back on airplanes, she tells me her first stop is Mexico. I was in Mexico in 2004 myself. The contrast between the city life of Havana, slow life of the beach resorts, are such polar opposites, but such a wonderful experience. Alas, let's pack those thoughts of holidays travel away for now, and let's learn more about how we can ensure those coming from other countries to fill job vacancies have the right to work. Stefana, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I first would like to thank you for the invitation. I hope you will enjoy today's presentation and you will be able to answer a lot of questions for yourself. So I'm going to start now. Okay. I hope you all see my screen. So welcome to everybody. Again, I hope you will enjoy today's session. Briefly, Jimmy said that we are organizing work permits and entry visas for people that would like to work in Ireland, but we are also focusing on business and tourist visas, document legalizations, passport renewals, or all kinds of documents that a corporate traveler would need in order to go into business in other countries. Today, of course, we are going to talk about the Irish work permits and all the stages that are involved into getting a non-EEA employee into Ireland. So it's basically 3 stages. The first one is the employment permit itself, which would give the applicant the right to work legally in Ireland. Then, in order to come to Ireland, they will need an entry visa, and the last step would be the permission stamp, or the so-called IRP card, formerly known as GNIB card. We are going to start with the employment permit. But as you can see, it's a document that contains the name of the employee, the employer's details, and actually all of the permissions that goes with it. This means also the salary and the occupation. Based on the salary and the occupation, the work permits are divided into several categories. The most common one is the critical skill employment permit, and as Jimmy said, the list is mostly focused on the highly skilled occupations. That's why most of the people would aim to get a critical skill permit because it's valid for 2 years. And 21 months after being employed on a critical skill employment permit, the applicant is actually able to apply for a stamp 4, which will give him the permission to work in Ireland without the need of obtaining any kind of a work permit. The other category is a general employment permit, and the difference between the first one is that at some point a labor market test or the so-called advertisement might be needed. This, of course, depends on the occupation and a little extent on the adverts. It should be 3 adverts, one into Jobs Ireland, another one in a national newspaper, and the third one could be on an online platform or a local newspaper. The thing about the advertisement is that it elongates the process of obtaining work permit simply because the labor market test should be live on Jobs Ireland for at least 28 days. So this is the rest of that could be between 3 and 28 days, but it should be at the same time while the advert on Jobs Ireland is live. There are a few cases where an advert can be skipped and you don't need it. First one is if the salary proposed is more than 64K per annum. Another case would be the work permit renewal. So if an employee is currently employed with the same employer and there will be no change in the salary or the occupation, the permit can be renewed without placing any adverts anywhere. There is one other case that you can skip the adverts, and this is if the applicant is actually being made redundant in the past 6 months and the Department of Enterprise is being notified within 4 weeks of the redundancy. So in this case, you can apply for general employment permit without the adverts, which again will shorten the processing time with 1 month. So another type of permit is designed for multinational companies. It's called intercompany employment permit, and it facilitates the transfer of a senior management or a key personnel from an overseas branch to the Irish one. This permit is valid for up to 36 months, and it's again very useful for multinational companies. The last one is called dependent partner or spouse employment permits. Actually, a year ago, the department removed this kind of permit. It's no longer called a permit, and any dependent or spouse can enter Ireland only based on the permission stamp of the employee that holds a work permit. So 1 permit less for the spouses and dependents. I would like to mention about the employment permits a few important things. The first one is that the conditions on the permit should never be breached, because this will definitely cause an audit for the company, for the employer, will terminate the permit for the employee, and will definitely jeopardize any future applications for work permit for both sides, and also any application for citizenship for the employee, so not required to breach. Another thing I'd like to mention is the validity, because a lot of people just forget to check the validity of their permits and when it expires. And as you understand, the process is long. It may take up to a few months sometimes. And in this case, we recommend that 2 or 3 months before the current permit expires, a process of a renewal is started. Or if a renewal is not needed, then application for a stamp 4 is submitted. About the process that you will see, and I'm going to talk, is just the one that we have established for the past 17 years, and we see it working, especially with recruiters. We separate it into those 5 steps. The first one would be an initial assessment. I call it initial because it's very brief and it's based only on the CV and the job offer. It's not a detailed assessment that would give the recruiter and the employer the right to understand if a certain applicant is eligible for a work permit, or the occupation is okay for a work permit to be processed. So on an initial stage, will be just the CV and the job offer, and maybe a job description, so we can determine if this application will go okay. If yes, and the applicant is approved by the employer, we send an information pack that contains all the documents required, how to obtain them, and an application form. This is taken from the applicant. And there are a few documents that are required from the employer as well. So once we review all of those documents, we make a detailed assessment, where sometimes, unfortunately, we are contacting the employer and we are saying that this application won't be successful based on our knowledge and experience, and we leave it to the employer to decide whether they would like to proceed and just try and obtain the work permit for this candidate. Of course, it's all about the time and the money involved into an application, and mostly the time, because currently the processing time, if I can say there is one positive thing into the work permits from the pandemic, is that finally the department throw away the papers and they're now issuing the permits online, which is very good and shortens the period. So currently the processing time of a standard application is about 6 to 7 weeks. And before it was 16 to 17, so you can make the difference yourself. For a trusted partner application, the processing time is 3 to 4 weeks. Every Monday, the department announces the processing time. So we can't say that this won't change next Monday. What is a trusted partner? I will just mention it briefly. A trusted partner application means that the employer has applied with the department for a trusted partner certificate. We recommend that these employers apply for such certificate if they're planning to hire a lot of non-EEA nationals into the company, because, as I said, it shortens the period of processing a work permit, issuing a work permit. Okay, so once the permit is issued, it's sent to both the employer and the employee. Now, as I mentioned, the work permits are issued for a period between 3 to 24 months, or 36 for the intercompany. And what if the applicant needs to come to Ireland for, let's say, 60 days? There is an atypical working scheme that is designed for such highly skilled people and allows them to work legally in Ireland for up to 90 days. It's not really a long-term work permit, and it can be issued only once for 12 months. So if you want to bring, let's say, project manager into an IT company, just to set up a team or a process, they can come on an atypical working scheme. So now you've got the work permit, you have the permission to work in Ireland. Now you need to come to Ireland. In order to come to Ireland, you would need an Irish entry visa. This is how it looks like. The only exception of a need of an entry visa is for people from US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. before COVID-19, South Africans, South Americans, and people from South Africa also were allowed to enter without an entry visa. For now, this is suspended. So we hope that this this will be lifted at some point. The Irish entry visa is her processing time. Its processing time is between 2 months and 2 weeks and 3 months, depending on the country where you apply for it, and it can be issued only after the work permit is issued. So it only, as I said, it only allows you to enter Ireland, no other rights. When people land in Ireland, the case officer or the border officer stamps their visa with a date, and until that date, they would need to apply for a residency, for permission to reside in Ireland. Just to note that this visa has a validity, so people need to enter Ireland only while it's valid. The process is simple on an application form, and depending on the country where you apply for it, you might be required to visit the visa center, or you might be just asked to post your passport and documents and no need to go there. Currently, unfortunately, due to the pandemic, a lot of visa centers are not working, and visas are not processed, or they're being asked to apply in another countries, which again elongates the process itself. So, as I said, we enter Ireland, and now we need the so-called IRP card, Irish Residency Permit. When you're given a date until which you need to apply for it, you are making an appointment with INIS, and this appointment, normally appointments are available 5 to 10 days from today's date. So we recommend that once you land in Ireland, you apply, you submit an application for this. The cost of it is €300. It takes 10 to 15 days, working days, to be issued. It's a plastic card. It contains, as you can see, the actual permission that you're given for the so-called stamp 1 into the critical skills permit and the general permits, and it also has a validity. It's normally valid for 1 year. So a month before it expires, we recommend that you book an appointment and apply for a renewal. If you're in Dublin, you do it in INIS directly. If you're not in Dublin, you do it in your local guard station. So it's very important that you don't let your IRP cards expire, because you have to leave the country and reapply again for an entry visa and go through the whole process again. Okay, so we have prepared a few important things that everyone who recruits non-EEA nationals, and we believe that this is an absolute must before you decide whether you take the employer or not. So current immigration status, what I mean by that is that we need to understand whether the candidate is in Ireland or is out of Ireland. So if they're outside Ireland, the process is clear. We apply for the permit and the entry visa and so forth. If the applicant is in Ireland, we will need to see the IRP card so we can determine what his current status and what are his or her rights at the moment. So if the applicant is on a short-term status, such as tourism or a business visit or atypical scheme, this person would have to leave Ireland, and then we are able to apply for the permit, and this person should stay outside of Ireland while the process of a work permit and an entry visa is on. If this person is in a long-term status, stamp 1, or is a spouse or dependent, then we would need to know until when the status is valid. For example, if the IRP card of this person expires in 3 weeks, obviously we won't be able to apply for a permit, and this person would have to leave, and then we apply outside of Ireland. If they're, let's say, 3 months, it's absolutely enough for a permit to be issued or renewed, depending on the case, and then this person can stay in Ireland. Of course, these are details that we are always looking at when we receive an application or request from any HR agency. Another two things that I've mentioned before: the CV and the job offer. This will give us a clue if this applicant can apply, or if the employer will need to change something into the job offer, the salary or the working hours, and then the work permit will be successful. Passport. A lot of people don't pay attention to that until the application actually starts. The passport needs to be valid for at least 15 months from the application date, because if it's not valid, we won't be able to apply for the permit, for the visa, then to enter Ireland, then to find a place to renew the passport. So 15 months is the minimum of the passport validity. I'm saying that because if an employer is in a hurry and they need the applicant to come to Ireland urgently, and this applicant has to renew the passport, this would elongate with one more month as normal passports. 20 days or 30 days, depending on the country. It takes a lot of time as well. And last but not least, the qualifications or the membership certificates. For what we mean by that is that in order to practice certain occupations in Ireland, in the health care or accounting or taxes, mostly social related occupations, you would need to be registered with the relevant regulatory body in Ireland. In some cases, registrations with the regulatory bodies in home country are acceptable, but not in all cases. So we are checking this for our clients, and we are confirming if this qualification suffices. Okay, so we've talked about the employee, what the employee would need to have in order to be eligible. Now let's talk about the employer, because this is a two-side process, and the employers need to be eligible as well. So what is needed by registration? What we mean is registration at the Revenue Office, the company registration office, and the company must be trading in Ireland. So the basic. No subcontracting. What this means is that if the employer plans to subcontract the employee that is on a work permit, this is not going to work. So an example of subcontracting could be that, let's say in an auditing company, the company Z has an employee that is a non-EEA, and company Z is hired by company Y, and there is a specific report that has to be done for company Y. The employee can do it on the premises of company Z, can attend meetings with company Y, but can't work on their premises, will be paid by them directly. So this should be mentioned to the employers before an application goes live. 50-50 rule, it means that at the time of the submission of the application, the employer should not have more than 50% of their staff to be non-EEA employees. So at the time of the application, we confirm that. Normally, this rule is never, is never waived, but there is a case where it can be, and this is if it's a startup company that's registered for the last 2 years, but we didn't have much of those cases. The salary, depending on the kind of permit that you're applying, employers should not offer less than 30K per annum for a general work permit application and 32K per annum for a critical skill employment permit. There is, of course, exceptions made only for graduates that for students that graduated in the last 12 months, and they are on the critical skill occupation list. This is then the salary can be 27K, but again, this exception should be looked very carefully because again, it may jeopardize the approval of the work permit. Another exception is for people that are fluent in, let's say, exotic language that is not available in the European Union, and then for this kind of people normally are offered sales roles or online digital marketing specialists. In these cases, the salary can go down to 27K, but it's not recommended again. And again, the occupation, why I mentioned eligible occupations, because for both the critical skill and the general employment permits, there is a list of eligible occupations. Example of not eligible occupations is pretty much everyone in the hospitality, fitness instructors, waitresses, or maîtresses, they cannot avail of the work permit program. So I mentioned before a little about the stamps. Once you get an IRP card, you're being stamped and granted a certain permission. I'll just go very quickly through all 6 stamps. Stamp 0, it's for people that are visiting academics at an Irish university or college. Stamp 1 is the one that our applicants avail of. It's for work permit or working holiday authorization holders. Stamp 1A, this is a special permission, and it's given to trainee accountants that are being paid full-time in an accountancy training firm. Stamp 1G, this is for graduate students. I mentioned before, for partners and spouses, they're being stamped with Stamp 1G based on the permit of their spouse. The people on 1G can work for 40 hours per week, and they don't have to apply for a work permit for a year. Stamp 2, the full-time students. The students can work 20 hours per week during school time and 40 hours when they're on vacation, during vacation. Stamp 2A, this is for full-time students for a course that is not on the official internal list of eligible programs. Stamp 3, family members of permit holders, they don't have the right to work. Stamp 4, the one that every permit holder is aiming for. This actually gives permission for you to stay and work legally in the country without the need of obtaining any kind of work permit. Everybody who's been on a critical skills and have a critical skills employment permit and has 21 months of continuous work for a certain employer can avail of a Stamp 4 application. What we do before anyone goes to INIS and apply for a Stamp 4 is that we review their case and we calculate exactly how many days and months they have in the country, so they can be sure that they can avail of the Stamp 4 permission. People on a general employment permit, they can apply for Stamp 4 if they've been on a job for 5 years. Stamp 5, permission to stay in Ireland without a time limit, doesn't give you the right to work. And then Stamp 6 is for Irish citizens with dual citizenship. So before we've asked if you have any questions, and there is one question that came through about the refugees. It's very important to divide the refugee steps on whether they are in Ireland or outside of Ireland. If somebody is granted refugee status in Ireland, they can stay in Ireland indefinitely, and they enjoy the rights and responsibilities similar to those with an Irish citizenship. Those that are outside, so no, we'll return to that. Refugees in Ireland don't have to apply for any kind of work permit. While refugees outside of Ireland would need a work permit in order to come and work to Ireland. They'll need an entry visa as well. We've also asked what's the difference between the passport, the Irish travel document, and the driving license, and what rights you get with those kind of IDs. The passport, it's the most commonly used worldwide travel document. It allows you to apply for all kinds of visas, for work permits. It allows you to travel where a visa is not required. Irish travel document, a good example of people that can get it are actually the refugees. They can go in and out of Ireland without the need of an entry visa. Other people that can avail of this document are people with international protection. So no need of a visa, just Irish travel document. The driving license, you can't apply with it for a work permit, you can't apply with it for a visa, but if there is a mutual agreement between both countries, home country and Ireland, then you can use your driving license in Ireland. If not, you go through the Irish process and apply for a driving license. So basically, that's from me. Brief about the work permits. This is a topic that can bring a lot of questions. I'm sure it's a very wide topic. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation. If you have any questions, you can ask them in the questions and answers box. Here are our contact details where you can contact us at any time. If you have any specific questions, at the end, by the end of the day today, we're going to send you a booklet with all the information that we've talked about, more detailed information, and our contact details again if you need our support in your future application.
Stefana, thank you. Thanks so much. A lot to take in for everyone, but some really, really useful information. As Stefana mentioned, they're pulling together a little booklet with all of that information in there, and they'll give that to Anna, who will be able to circulate it to all the attendees a little later on. Keep your questions coming in. I see lots of them coming in there using the question box on your screen, and we get to as many of those as possible very, very shortly. Next, we have a brief rundown on the visas that are suitable for contracting roles. There are only a few scenarios where work permits and visas are suited to professionals accepting a contract role. So this will be brief, but it is worth including as it's an area where many questions arise. I see a couple coming in there already. My colleague Jennifer Doyle is going to cover these. Many of you will already know Jen as our Solutions Consultant Manager. She and her team are the guys and girls who speak to every single new contractor to determine the best solution for them, depending on their contract length and their expected earnings. Jennifer, over to you for this whistle-stop tour.
Thanks, Jimmy. And thanks as well to Stefana. I think that was a great presentation. There's some really kind of practical and useful information I think that everybody will probably take away. So as Jimmy mentioned, I will be brief. I'm just going to pull up some slides here now. I know there's probably lots of questions that are coming in, so I won't take up too much time. I'll just make sure that I'm sharing there. Okay, so great. So I suppose, look, as Jimmy mentioned, what we do at Contracting Plus is obviously support contractors, and contractors work in a slightly different manner to your typical employee. So I suppose to start, just for anybody maybe who isn't as familiar with contracting or doesn't engage contractors, just a brief definition on what contracting actually is. So a contractor is an individual who provides their skills or services to a client for a specific period of time on a project basis. So these are highly skilled individuals, and they're often working in niche areas with very in-demand skill sets. They'll work over the course of their contracting career with, you know, multiple clients, multiple companies, and they're going to be moving around from role to role quite frequently. In terms of any candidates that I suppose you guys are engaging from a recruitment perspective, generally, when a contractor engages with Contracting Plus, they will already have their visas and work permissions already in place. So Contracting Plus, you know, we wouldn't be able to provide or sponsor, you know, work permits or visas. Obviously, what we do is provide an accounting and tax solution. So generally, when you're engaging with a candidate on a contract position, the first thing, you know, that we'd recommend you do is kind of just have a review of the relevant documentation. So as Stefana has mentioned, you know, there's lots of different paperwork, documentation that can be looked at. There's residence cards, there is permission letters maybe that the candidate will hold, and then also that physical stamp in the passport. And we'd recommend you do this early on in the kind of, I suppose, engagement process with the candidate, especially if your client has a specific need, because as Jimmy has alluded to, not every type of work permission is going to be appropriate for contractors. So take a look at the documentation, you know, see if you can identify any restrictions around how, when, where the individual can work. If you're not sure, you know, if you've received the documentation and you're not sure exactly what you're looking at, obviously we're more than happy to kind of take a look. If you've the permission from the candidate to share that, we can take a look at that for you. But ultimately what you're trying to understand is, does this individual have the right to work without condition, you know, on the amount of hours that they work or the structure through which they operate. Once, you know, that has been identified, you know, then we can move into looking at a suitable tax structure. So we would be able to provide an umbrella or a personal limited company, and the work permission that the candidate holds can obviously vary on the type of solution that is used and whether, you know, they're going to be able to work on a contract basis. So I suppose just to give you an idea, for umbrella companies, so an umbrella company would generally be most commonly used by those who are new to contracting. You know, anybody who's starting out as a contractor for the first time, umbrella company is very easy to use. So if the individual has an EEA passport, I suppose that's worth mentioning. You know, if you hold an EEA passport, you do have the ability to come to Ireland, live and work here without an additional, you know, employment permit. And there are certain stamps that are also appropriate for work as a contractor. So the stamp 4G, I think that Stefana had mentioned, you know, that allows you to pretty much work without condition. You can establish and operate a business. You can work as a self-employed individual. So certainly you can work through the likes of an umbrella company structure. There are other stamps also. So for example, things like the stamp 1G in certain instances whereby, you know, the individual does not need a second employment permit to work. They do have the ability when they're, you know, coming in on that spousal visa. So that can be something that we can look at as well. Generally speaking, you know, when you're engaging with contractors, they're individuals who are working, you know, on long-term projects, highly skilled and high rates. So the type of stamp will also kind of be important in assessing whether, you know, the right solution can be provided. It kind of goes without saying, but I suppose anything that is employer specific, you know, is not going to be appropriate for contracting. So for example, you know, if somebody's coming in maybe on a critical skills, if they're being sponsored by an employer, obviously they're going to be engaged directly by that employer. So that would be an employment model instead. And anybody on a, you know, a visiting or holiday permission, of course, if they don't have the right to work, they're not going to be able to work in any capacity. So that would be maybe the stamp 0. For personal limited companies, so this would be where an individual operating as a contractor decides to set up their own company. So essentially they're establishing a business. So again, you know, they can do so if they're coming into Ireland with an EU passport. Interestingly, also they have to be an EEA resident. So most candidates who are relocating into Ireland or who are already here in Ireland will fit that. But obviously now with, you know, the implications that have come in with Brexit, you know, that can impact how some of the UK contractors are coming into Ireland and working as well. So again, these are just the things, I suppose, that are worth identifying early on in the conversation and early on in the process. If somebody has that stamp 4, again, we can absolutely assist them in setting up and establishing a business. And again, look, anything that is, employer specific, visiting, holiday permissions, we're not going to be able to that individual is not going to have that right to work as a contractor. So very brief, I know. I suppose really look, if there is any questions, obviously, as I said, more than happy to answer. Really, I think the key takeaway is just to get the documentation in, have the discussion with the candidate, early on, and make sure you understand, is it an appropriate, solution or structure for contracting as well as employment. And that's me.
Thank you, Jennifer. Nice and simple, really. So ideally stamp 4 for contracting, but there are some exceptions. Okay, so we're going to waste no time and head straight into questions. We'll just give Anna a couple of seconds to bring everybody back on screen. Also joining us for the Q&A is Stefana's colleague, Cassie Vasileva. For the last 8 years, Cassie has been specialising in visa and employment permits, and she's Visa First's expert problem solver. Cassie, thank you for joining us, and welcome back on screen, Stefana. Okay, so we've loads of questions. I'm just going to jump right in and start calling out some of the quicker ones first. I'm just going to call these out, and Cassie and Stefana, you might just decide amongst yourselves who's the best person to answer them. Maybe this is a nice easy one. Can recruitment agencies apply for trusted partnership status?
So the trusted partner status is for the company that will be the actual employer. And since permits are actually meant for people who will be direct employee, an agency can benefit of it only in the process of hiring employees who will be working for the agency directly. For example, recruitment consultant. So if a recruitment agency is expanding and planning to hire a large number of recruitment consultants, then yes, the trusted partner status can be very beneficial for them. But the benefits cannot be transferred to the customers or the clients or the partners of that agency.
Okay, brilliant. A couple of questions here about the CSP permit. So when applying for a CSP, what start date of employment should be added onto the application? For example, 4 weeks, 8 weeks, or 12 weeks ahead?
So when discussing the start date, we usually recommend employers and employees to discuss first the company needs or the project needs, and then to have in mind the processing times. So, for example, if the project starts in a month, then it will be a bit unrealistic to put a date in a month. But if the employee will need an entry visa, then additional month or even a little bit more should be added, and had in mind if advertising will be required, which is not the case with the critical skills permit, of course, but I'm just adding that, this should also be considered. So technically, a permit application can be submitted 16 weeks in advance before that date, but the date is based on the company needs and if a visa or advertising or any additional stages will be required as part of the process, sorry.
Okay, so and there's just a quick follow-on question there on CSPs. Can an agency obtain a CSP, then place that employee in another site, having declared that site on the permit, while still being paid as an employee of the agency?
So this is probably the most asked question because subcontracting is not allowed under employment permit schemes. Technically, I would say no, but there are some exceptions. For example, somebody in the questions mentioned big auditing and financial companies. We have seen that also with engineering companies. So under employment permit, the employee cannot work under the supervision of another company or be paid by the other company. So in some cases, big companies, they have something like their own department on site of another company. So this could be considered as some sort of an exception, because in this case, the employee is still being paid by the employer mentioned on the permit and is still being supervised by people working for the same company, even though the physical location is not owned by the company. But this should be clearly stated in the employment permit application, and it's always printed on the actual permit. So if the department sends somebody to check, the legal documents show that the employee has the right to work. But as I mentioned, this is a very specific exception. A company can't just send an employee, relocate a single employee somewhere and leave him or her there for the whole duration of the permit.
Okay, very good. So there's a couple here that are similar, so I'm going to try and group them together to see can we get through a couple. In the case of the application process for the employment permit, would the candidate need to have the job offer secured first, or would they need to have the employment permit or visa? Sorry, would the agency need to have the employment permit or visa before making the offer to the applicant? So I suppose which one comes first?
So an employment permit application cannot be submitted without an actual job offer. Having a contract or an offer is a mandatory requirement. So this is what comes first. And that can be an issue for some companies because they want to see the candidate, they want to work. That's why, for example, Stefano mentioned that atypical program. This is also suitable for bringing employees in for something like a test period so that they know if they will work together. The problem is, as she mentioned, that they're required to leave the country in order for the employment permit process to be started. And in relation to that question, I also saw another question if related to that, and I would like to mention that for the critical skills permit, there is a special program called highly skilled job interview, which is very beneficial for companies willing to hire professionals, because this is the only exception that would allow a foreign national to enter Ireland, attend the interview, and stay in Ireland while the permit is being organized. But as I mentioned, this applies only to high skilled professionals, and the role that will be offered should be on the critical skills list. If we have more questions about that, we can discuss that with specific companies, but this is the general rule.
Brilliant. Thanks, Cassie. And I'd say this one here is for you. I have a candidate with a stamp 4 who we were placing on a 6-month contract. Can she claim her rent and travel expenses?
This is not a work permit related question, so I'm not able to provide a specific answer to that question.
Yeah, I'd say, Jennifer, can you jump in there?
Yeah, I suppose if somebody is relocating for a contract position, there can be expenses that can be claimed. Typically, yes. So if the individual is relocating for a long-term contract, they can claim, the first 3 months rent. If they are relocating, they can claim an initial kind of 10-day allowance for temporary accommodation. They can claim the cost of the relocation. So potentially, yes, there are allowances. Certainly, we actually have a section on relocation on our website, so we can pop that in the chat maybe if there's any questions around the expenses. We can obviously give advice. If they're operating on a stamp 4, they'll be able to engage as a contractor. So yeah.
Okay, brilliant. I'd say this is back to you now, Cassie. Can an agency apply for a stamp 1 visa for a temporary worker who is on a stamp 1G visa currently?
So if a person is in Ireland on stamp 1G or even stamp 2, they can apply for an employment permit. But you mentioned agency. So as I mentioned before, agencies can apply for employment permits only for people who will be directly employed by them. But yes, if a person is in Ireland on a stamp 1, stamp 1G, stamp 2, or stamp 3, they are allowed to apply for an employment permit, having in mind that their current status should be valid for long enough in order to for the process to be completed.
Okay, and what permission do stamp 1G students apply for after their 1G expires?
So with 1G, there are 2 options. Students who complete a bachelor degree in Ireland, they can apply for stamp 1G for 1 year. If they complete a master degree course, they have the option to apply for a 2nd year 1G. What we know from experience is that a lot of employers don't really prefer hiring 1G holders. They prefer stamp 1 employment permits. So at any point during the validity of 1G, they can switch to an employment permit.
Brilliant. Okay. There's one here. A person applying for a stamp 1 permit can operate a business. Essentially, this means they're self-employed. Does this mean they need to invest €1 million in a company in Ireland? So we know a little bit about this from contracting, and people asking us that question. It actually has to do with the immigration investor program. And yes, and Cassie, you might jump in here when I'm finished, but the individual has to invest €1 million in a company in Ireland. It has to be for a minimum of 3 years. It can't be borrowed money. It must be from their own resources, and it must be approved by a committee that meets a number of times a year. But I think one of the follow-on part of that question, Cassie, which I don't know the answer to, is if they have this permit, if they've made that investment, can they then take up a job or work as a contractor in Ireland when under this permit?
So if a person is an investor, he wouldn't actually get stamp 1G. Those investment programs, they lead to a different stamp. It's usually stamp 4 with different validity depending on the type of the program. And Jennifer already mentioned that stamp 4 gives the person a lot of rights, including the freedom to run own business. But the question was related to stamp 1. So if a person has stamp 1, then he or she is an employee of a company. That person can still be like the managing director or the financial manager or have another senior position. But stamp 1 is always an employee, which means this person can work only for the company listed on the permit.
Okay, great. So I'm actually just seeing some questions are coming into the chat area as well. So I'm just going to jump over there for a second, see can we get through some of those. The most common visas we hear about are the stamp 1G and the stamp 4, but can someone legally work in Ireland on any other stamp, stamp 5, for example?
So different stamps have different rights. Any stamp 3, for example, doesn't have any working rights. Stamp 5, it depends how it's issued. Usually, I would say yes, but when a stamp is approved, the person gets a letter, and this letter specifies the exact rights and if they're working rights or not. So in order to be sure, a company needs to check that.
Okay. Would a candidate on a stamp 2 that is currently here in Ireland need to leave the country to apply for a work permit?
No, as I mentioned in the beginning, if they have 1, 2, or 3 stamps, they can apply for a permit. What's important at this point is to have this stamp valid for long enough, because technically the department doesn't give exceptions. Currently with the COVID, there is a little, let's say, freedom because stamps are being extended because of the COVID, but companies shouldn't really rely on that exception.
Okay. Can a candidate change employer when they hold stamp 1 permit before being eligible for stamp 4?
Yes, but there are some restrictions. So if a person is a holder of an employment permit and this is the first employment permit, they're not supposed to change employers for the first 12 months. After that, if they find another offer, they have the freedom to have another application submitted and change employers. There is a little exception to that rule. Only if the employee is made redundant during those first 12 months and the department is notified following the relevant procedure, then an exception can be made and the new application can be submitted before the 12 months.
Okay. Jennifer, I'm going to throw this one to you because I've heard you talking about it on the phone in the office. In terms of the stamp 1G and the 40-hour restriction, sorry, the 20 to the 40-hour restrictions, and they talk about holiday time. Can you just confirm what, it doesn't follow the school holidays. Can you confirm what the holiday dates are?
I think that's actually maybe the stamp 2 that somebody's referring to there. Stamp 2, yeah, there is a stamp 2, which is like a student visa. So yes, there are determinations there around you can work 40 hours during a set period during the year and 20 hours during what is termed the school term, but that is set and determined. It's not specific to the individual. So just because your college or your school has specific hours doesn't mean that you can decide you're on holidays and work the 40 hours. So yeah, there are specific dates under which somebody would need to have that flexibility.
That's the 15th of December to the 15th of January.
Yes, and then there's also a period between June and September that they'd be considered the 40 hours as well.
Okay. Okay, we have someone who wants to join us who is currently working for another employer. They have a work permit valid until 2022. Can they change employer?
So as I mentioned, there is this 12-month requirement, but it applies only for the first permit of the person. So if the permit is valid until 2022, it means it was issued sometime in 2020, but without the specific date, I'm not able to say yes or no. So technically, if it has been more than 12 months, then definitely yes.
Okay. How long will a contractor be required to have a visa?
how long will a contractor be required to, like, I mean, usually somebody who's coming to get set up as a contractor will already hold the work permission and the visa. So most of those will have dates on them by which they need to renew. But I suppose with contracting, generally speaking, like, we're engaging with individuals who are either operating on like an EA passport or a stamp 4. So the length of time would be quite long for those. I don't know, Cassie, if you want to add anything in there. No?
No.
Okay, because I'm just looking at the time here, and there's something came into the question box. It's the last one I'm going to look at because I think it's a nice one, and it's thanks, Stefana. I've worked with Visa First and cannot recommend them highly enough. Look forward to the slides. So, you know, there's from somebody else's mouth. We are unfortunately out of time. But what a huge amount of learning here this morning. There are just two things left to do before we wrap up the session. The first is the usual giveaway. It wouldn't be a breakfast briefing without a little gift for someone watching at the end. So you'll recall I asked for 5 numbers at the start of this morning's session. And at the end of the event, Anna gets a list of all the attendees in the order in which they logged on. So those in positions 13, 36, 67, 8, and 7 will be the winners. Anna will be in touch with you for your postal address, and there'll be a small gift making its way to you, compliments of Contracting Plus. Finally, all that remains is for me to thank Stefana, Cassie, and Jennifer for their time this morning. On behalf of the NRF, thank you for logging in to another breakfast briefing. We'll take a break next month as the annual conference is on the 27th of May. There are some great speakers lined up for that already, with more to be announced, so make sure you get yourself booked onto that. I'll be back in June for another breakfast briefing. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.